So, Liz Truss was interviewed today by Laura Kuenssberg. Now, I saw commentary of this on Twitter, despite having not watched it myself. And as far as I was aware, Laura Kuenssberg really did pull her punches and wasn't particularly incisive with the way that she questions, definitely on comparison to the radio DJs from earlier on in the week. Yes, obviously, I made plenty of points when I was having a stream with Kevin Logan, talking about how, of course, she is the one who wants to maintain access to the political class, so her ability to actually hold these people at account is severely compromised. But whatever, we'll watch it, we'll see how she does, and we'll start straight away.
Energy bills of up to 6,000 country. And when I came into office...
What's going wrong here? Oh well. Clearly they're having some VT issues getting into the interview.
...the country. And when I came into office, people were facing energy bills of up to £6,000 this winter. We were facing rampant inflation and a slowing economy. So it was vitally important that we acted. And we've acted on all of those things. Making sure that people aren't paying more than £2,500, a typical family isn't, making sure we're dealing with the issue of inflation because our energy package is likely to reduce inflation by up to 5%, but also taking action to get the economy growing, because that is so vital, both to help us get through this winter, which is going to be incredibly tough, but also to build a better economy in the long term, one where there are higher wages, more jobs and more opportunities. So it's important that we acted. And if I'd come on your show, and I remember being on the show last month and you said to me, what are you going to do about these problems the country is facing? If I'd come on your show now and we hadn't acted on those things, we would be in serious trouble as a country.
The thing is that, again, this is exactly what you did on the radio discussions from earlier on in the week, right, where the central problem with the issues that's happening at the moment is the issue that there was no need to cut the 45% rate of tax. There was no need to give people, the bankers, extra bonuses, and there's no need to do this stuff. There's no need to compromise the revenue for the exchequer in the way that they have. Obviously, everyone agrees that they need to do something about the energy prices, and it's good that they've done that. But that is a completely separate issue to the rest of the quote-unquote fiscal event that they had the other week.
Say that on energy, just to be completely clear for people, you said that you've controlling bills for a typical family. What has actually happened is that you've capped the unit price, and many people may well end up still paying more than £2,500. And we should be crystal clear about that, shouldn't we?
Yeah.
And it's also bad, obviously, when we pointed this out on stream when we were listening in the I think that she understands that it means a typical family and that it's based on a unit price, and that she didn't actually mean to say it's capped at £2,500, right? She clearly misspoke. But you're the Prime Minister, right? You're the most powerful person in the country. You need to get this shit right to make sure you're communicating with the voters. It's clear she has no idea how to communicate at all, because, if you look at her, she's a soporific charisma vacuum, right? But even so, you need to get basic facts like that incredibly crystal clear when you're doing public interviews. Otherwise, things could get sticky pretty quickly.
This is the bill for an average family, but what we are preventing is those extraordinary bills that people were expecting. It is a big energy package, and it's the biggest part of our mini budget. And it was important that the government stepped in to deal with this. And we're not just dealing with it, as the Labour Party have suggested, for 6 months. We're dealing with it for 2 years to make sure people have that reassurance.
Now, I've criticised the fact that the Labour Party specifically said that it was only they'd made a plan for the next 6 months. But that doesn't mean that they don't actually have a plan for longer than 6 months, right? I think Rachel Reeves mentioned previously, as much as I hate to defend Rachel Reeves, that they said they would come back and then they would review it in 6 months' time to see what other things would be done in future. So to say that, or they only planned for 6 months isn't, and therefore implying that people's bills were then going to go up after that 6 month period, that's pretty disingenuous.
So they're not facing those ultra high.
And you've made that point about your energy offer to the country. You've made that very clear. But something else has happened in the last 7 days that's not just about what you're doing on energy bills. As we come on air today, people are worried about their mortgages. They're worried about their rent. They're worried about being able to pay their business loans. Do you feel any responsibility for that anxiety?
So I understand how worried people are. And I understand that people are struggling, and it's very, very difficult times. And this is a global problem. You know, we've got Putin's war in Ukraine, the aftermath of
But that's not why they care about their mortgages and pensions. It is the crash in the markets due to their uncertainty about the UK economy, given on the fact that you'd committed to a substantial amount of borrowing, whilst also then cutting funding from the exchequer by removing the top rate of tax. This is exactly why the markets have been spooked and why people's mortgages and pensions are being threatened, right? The Bank of England had to print extra £65 billion just to prop up our pension funds so they didn't just collapse overnight. And that is ending on the 14th of October. Something's going to have to be done between now and then. And that's before the official budget, that's going to happen on 23rd of November. That's months away.
COVID. And what is happening around the world is that interest rates are rising. So the Federal Reserve have pushed its interest rates up to 4%. You know, this is a global
But this
phenomenon.
is not just a global problem. Absolutely, there are issues in economies right around the world right now. But this is not just...
And also, there's a difference between interest rates rising over time to be able to meet the needs of the economy as they change, and the interest rates being hiked by a massive amount, essentially overnight, because idiots are in charge making stupid, fiscal commitments. These are two completely different things.
a global problem.
100%, mate. She's like, absolutely despise her.
What happened when you announced the measures in your mini budget? Billions.
Such a weasel, such a weasel. I mean, to be fair, she probably learnt it from Tony Blair, but just weaseling away out of answering any questions by just going, war in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin, global problem, inflation. Like, no, you need to give us a more substantive answer as to why you've decided to crash the economy overnight.
Pounds of tax cuts with no information about how those would be paid for. Billions of pounds of extra borrowing with no clarity about how they would be paid for. What happened was that the pound slumped, interest rates shot up, and that has left people in this country with a deep sense of worry as a result of the decisions that you and your Chancellor made. Do you accept that?
Well, first of all, I want to reassure people that we do have a very clear plan. First of all,
you've got a clear plan. It doesn't make it a good one. We all know exactly what your plan is, and that is give rich people more money. We know exactly that is what your plan is. But then I could have a very clear plan of me walking into a wall for 5 hours. Will that achieve anything? No. But it'll certainly do less damage than what you're doing to the economy.
About how we are going to get through this winter with our energy plan.
And you've made that point, but
also,
I'm asking you about what was
how we
unleashed
are,
by the mini budget.
how we are.
I mean, that's definitely coming, Alex. Right? That's definitely coming. In that they've crashed their party's economic credentials so badly that 33 points behind in the polls. That's unrecoverable as far as I'm concerned. If you're only planning on fighting any kind of future election on the subject of the economy and fiscal prudence or whatever, and with their entire economic credibility shut up the wall, they're going to certainly have to pivot incredibly hard on social issues. So expect more demonisation of migrants, demonisation of Muslims, and of course huge restrictions against trans people. Like Suella Braverman is already ramping up the kind of culture war sentiments to try and prepare for this stuff, given what Suella said on international students and migrants and all that kind of stuff. Just today, I think it was.
With the issue of a slowing economy, and this is important
we'll
because we also needed to act. Laura, this is why we had to act, and that's the point I want to make clear.
And
we had to act.
Yeah, you had to act on the energy crisis, which you did act on. You did act on the energy crisis by committing to more borrowing to be able to pay for the wholesale prices to be able to sell to the electricity generators. Fine, good, whatever. No one has any qualms with that. The fact that you then committed to then reducing the budget of the exchequer by cutting the top rate of tax it's insanity.
Yeah, we had to act as well.
Based fucking congratulations.
On taxation to make sure people weren't paying those national insurance rises going into this winter. And we also had to act on other areas of taxation
I'd like
to make sure the economy didn't slow down any further. And this is important because what the government is trying to avoid is a serious economic slowdown that would have real difficulties for people. Now,
But you're causing an economic slowdown. What do you think is going to happen when the pound collapses? Again, you're saying, we need to combat inflation, and the energy plan that she did announce was actually good at combating inflation. It would reduce inflation by 5%, as she's saying, but the price of everything is now going up because of the drop in the pound, especially imported goods, right? If we were making loads of money off exports, it would be not be as bad, but our exports have also tanked because we've left the single market.
I did want to answer your question, Laura, that you asked me about the issues we've seen this week. So I'm afraid there is an issue that interest rates are going up around the world. and we do have to face that, and we do have to do that. But I do want to say to people, I understand their worries about what has happened this week, and I do stand by the package we announced, and I stand by the fact that we announced it quickly because we had to act. But I do accept we should have laid the ground better. I do accept that.
You accept you should
and
have laid the ground
I have
better.
learnt from that. I have learnt from that, and I will make sure that in future we do a better job of laying the ground.
Laying the ground, fine, you've acknowledged what there was a problem with communications, you should have explained things better. But I want to show our audience and you what actually happened, because this is not just a global problem, it's not arguably just a problem of communications, it's a problem
But literally, what's she gonna show, sorry?
consequence of the decision that you made. If we look at this graph, and you can look at it over there, Prime Minister, you can see what happened to the cost of government borrowing. On the day that you made that announcement, it spiked, and it didn't just spike, it's predicted to stay high for long. Now, the reason that matters...
Well, that's basically the point I was going to make there, in that, you've just committed to a huge amount of government borrowing. Fine, not a problem. Happy with government borrowing, especially when at the time interest rates were, on the yields on borrowing on bonds and government bonds and gilts was actually not massively higher. Obviously, it continued to increase up to that point, but then massively spiked after the announcement. And you said, well, I'm going to commit to borrowing more money, and then because you've spooked the markets by cutting a huge rate of tax, you've then led to making the borrowing that you've already committed to even more expensive. It's just nonsensical.
Is when it costs the government more to borrow, everything costs more. Everybody feels the increase in interest rates, whether that's on government, on mortgages, on people's rents. This is a direct consequence of the decisions you made last week. And interest rate increases are going to mean pressure on people's mortgages and less money for public services.
We have been in a very long period of low interest rates. And the fact is that due to the war in Ukraine perpetrated by Russia, interest rates are rising around the world. And we've seen that in the United States, and we've seen that in Europe. So
But this is
I
about what happened
don't
last week.
accept, Laura, I don't accept that part of your argument.
But again, there's a difference between interest, as I said previously, there's a difference between interest rates rising over time and then the market readjusting, and interest rates spiking overnight because of dumb fiscal policy.
But now, on the subject of government borrowing, I think it is right.
Forget Truss. We'll come to that. We'll jump to that in a second. But look, on that graph, that is a spike in the cost of borrowing for the government, which feeds through to everybody else as a direct result of the decisions that you announced on September the 23rd. This is not about what was going on in the war in Ukraine already. We know that that's a huge challenge. But look at the direct result on that day. And the chief economist at the Bank of England,
That is not the same as interest rates, though, Laura.
But it
so
all
I think
feeds through.
the audience should be clear that that is not the same as interest.
I wonder why she's threatening to karate chop Laura Kuenssberg for the most lightest of probing into the catastrophic nature of her fiscal policy.
rates,
it all feeds
which are
through.
rightly set by the Independent Bank of
But
England.
it's about the cost of government borrowing, and that feeds through to so many other things. And there are problems in other countries around the world. But the Bank of England's chief economist has said the rise in borrowing undoubtedly had a UK-specific component. Standard & Poor's, who are one of the world's biggest credit rating agencies, put the government on notice, saying that the country might have a credit downgrade. You can't just say this is something that's happening around the world.
No, and I think we've made the right decision to borrow more this winter to deal with the
No one's disputing this.
extraordinary circumstances we face.
To deal also with
Because
the tax cuts you want to give people.
the alternative, Laura, let's remember what the alternative was. The alternative was
No, don't talk about the alternatives. Let's talk about specifically the fiscal policy outside of the borrowing that has been committed to be able to keep people's energy bills low. That is the issue that we're having. Again, it's just classic
would be
deflection.
paying up to £6,000 on their energy bills. Inflation would be 5% higher than it would be otherwise, and we would be facing a worse economic slowdown. That was the alternative. We're not living in a perfect world. We're living in a very difficult world where governments around the world are making tough decisions.
And you've explained
and
your
I
energy
believe it was the
package.
right decision to increase borrowing this winter. We have the second lowest borrowing in the G7. So we currently borrow less than France, we borrow less than the United States, we borrow less than Canada, we borrow less than Japan. And I think it's important people understand that.
And it's perfectly normal for
of
governments to
course,
borrow lots of money,
course
but
it is.
I just
And
want-
of course, we need to bring down borrowing.
Also compares to how much money is actually coming into the exchequer. It does help if you're, say, I don't know, France, and you've just borrowed loads of money to renationalise Electricité de France and bring it completely under government control, and then you gain a bunch of extra revenue because you control more of the company and therefore generate more money in the long run. It also depends, it doesn't matter just how much you're borrowing, it depends what you're borrowing it for. And she's borrowing money to just give it to the gas extractors to buy gas in the wholesale market.
As a proportion of GDP over the medium term, and I have a plan to do that.
Well, will you tell
but
us
what
that
would
plan
be
this
wrong?
morning?
What would be wrong, Laura, is for us not to have acted, and for families to be facing those appalling bills this winter, for the economy to be slowing more, and for us to be facing businesses going out of business and the UK not being
The
competitive.
economy took fright last week. I mean, you say this is about all about getting the economy growing.
I accept,
the short-term
Laura,
reaction was horror on the financial markets.
I've been honest, Laura, that we should have laid the ground better, but we have been dealing with.
Just don't do the tax right. Just don't, sorry, tax cut rather. Just don't get rid of the top rate of tax. Just don't do it. There's no reason to do it.
A unique set of circumstances here in the United Kingdom, which I think the public can appreciate. I want to reassure people that we have a clear plan moving forward, both to deal with the energy crisis and to deal with inflation, but also to get the economy growing and to put us on a good long-term footing. And what we also announced last week was...
Again, it would help if you provided literally any evidence as to why your gross tax cut and your needless increase in bankers' bonuses would, quote unquote, make us more competitive and grow the economy. Because people, in the specific tax that she's cut is income. So this is people who get an employment from the company that they work at, not people who are getting paid out in stock options, not people who get paid out in dividends, not people who are making money off capital gains. And these people are usually people who have no reason to then move outside of the country.
Plans to speed up road projects, speed up broadband projects, get Britain moving.
Essentially, she's talking more about things that she's going to spend public money on. I'm like, what public money? You've just massively cut the amount of money that's going to come into the exchequer.
And moving us towards the high growth, low tax economy that we need to be in order to fund our public services.
No, we don't need to be a low tax, high growth economy to be able to fund our public services. I mean, we could be a high growth economy, but that in no way necessitates lower taxes.
That's what's important to me.
And you've made that very clear, that getting the economy growing is your priority. But what many of your MPs fear is, because interest rates are on the way up, because the cost of government borrowing is going up, as we've seen this morning, the fear is that the consequences will be more taxpayers' cash will be eaten up, there'll be less money for everything else. Are you going to cut public
service? And again, it's so frustrating. Again, someone made a really good point about this on Twitter, in that when you look at the way Laura Kuenssberg questions around this, it's all a political game, right? It's all essentially just like politics as the Westminster soap opera, rather than we're talking about the real issues that are going to materially affect people who now can't pay their mortgages in the future. Like, what's going to happen when in 2 weeks' time, when all of those bonds that got bought out by the Bank of England's quantitative easing suddenly then back on the precipice as these expire, right? What's going to happen to people who get evicted from their house because the landlord is having to put up the rents to be able to deal with the additional cost of their mortgage, their interest-only mortgage, may I remind you all, a lot of the time, that they've taken out to be able to do that, right? Obviously, the landlord is awful, and there's at least one of the bright things, the silver linings toward the cloud of this ridiculous policy is that a bunch of landlords might be forced to sell up, but they're just going to be forced to sell up to an even bigger corporation that will still probably be a landlord and then still engaged in awful landlordism, right? So I'm not gonna feel sorry for the landlords, but at the end of the day, it's all these costs will end up getting passed on to renters because our system is so screwed up. There's people's real lives are in danger here. People are in danger of being pushed out onto the streets. There's danger of total economic collapse. And she's talking about, oh, well, don't you think, maybe this is optically bad, could you have communicated better? No, talk about what's really happening, Laura. And again, it's all softball. It's all just, we're not treating this with the gravitas that it demands.
Spending.
I don't accept that argument, and I will do what I can to win the hearts and minds of my colleagues across the Conservative Party, because I believe we need to grow the size of the pie. That's fundamentally what we need to do as a country, and we've had 2 decades of relative...
And she says this every fucking interview. She says this over and over and over again. It's clear. It's very, very clear to me that grow the size of the pie is going to be this year's magic money tree, just like Theresa May did in 2017. And no one really bought into this magic money tree nonsense, which is why it's stupid that I saw people in fucking Labour Party doing the same thing. Absolute nonsense. When it's clear, we now know that there is indeed a magic money tree, and it's called the Bank of England's quantitative easing, because they were very, very happy to just inject huge amounts of cash into the economy to be able to stabilise pension funds. Like, you can do these things, and then pension funds can just be stabilised by the Bank of England anyway. Like, absolutely fine.
Low growth. I'm answering your question, Laura. What low growth means? Low growth means people aren't able to get the jobs they deserve.
No, my
they
question
mean
was whether
lower
you're going to cut
wages, and
public
they mean
spending,
less
Minister.
money
No,
for public services.
They mean, but are
So this
you
is why
going to cut
growth
public
is so
spending?
important.
Yeah, and so when George Osborne got rid of the 50% rate of tax, did we see an additional growth? In fact, the growth was lower in the 5 years of the coalition government between 2010 to 2015, post financial crisis. There was lower growth under them with the lower tax rate than there was under Gordon Brown with a 50% tax rise again between 2008 and 2010. So this idea that suddenly we'll be able to, quote, grow the size of the pie by cutting the top rate of income tax and then give people the good jobs they deserve, again, this is just fantasy. Like, again, as we saw in Question Time, the question was, are they engaging in fantasy economics? This is all just praxeology. This is where it's all based, because obviously the IEA is full of, objectivists and libertarians and people from the Austrian School of Economics. So they genuinely believe in this praxeology shit.
And that is at the core of our economic
But are
policy.
you going to cut public spending? Because one of your cabinet ministers said this week, Simon Clarke, he said, we look at a state which is extremely large and we have to look at how we can make...
Extremely large. We have a tiny state. What are you talking about? Again, I think I made this point the other day as well. I made that point the other day in that the reason why we have to have high tax rates in the UK to deal with the level of things, for example, we have plenty of public services that do need being paid for. For example, like the NHS, for example, like public schools, like a bunch of stuff that the Exchequer has to pay out for, pensions, benefits, etc. But what we don't have is any alternative revenue for the state outside of the taxation system, because neoliberalism has stripped away all of the government assets to the point at which we now have to have huge taxation to pay for the social services and security that we need. Whereas you look at somewhere like Norway, they actually have similar rates of tax, slightly less than we do. It's stratified differently, but they don't need to have any higher tax rates because they have government-owned enterprises that generate revenue for their government to be able to spend on their sovereign wealth fund, and therefore they get to have that is what a big government is. By saying we have a bloated state and we need to strip away from it, what's she going to strip away? By strip away, she obviously means benefits. She means public services, and she means potentially the NHS as well. So again, if you really, really want a low tax economy, you're going to have to either take away huge amounts of funding from public services, or you're going to have to get revenue for the Exchequer by some other means, and it's going to have to be with state-owned enterprises or some other kind of different tax. But then again, how can you then call yourself a low tax economy from that point?
Sure, that is in full alignment with a lower tax economy. Now, what does that mean?
Well, I believe in getting value for money for the taxpayer. That's very important to me. And the way that we are going to improve our economy is, for example, helping more people get into work. That saves the government money, but it also contributes to the economy. So what we will have is a long-term plan for reform, help more people get into work, make our economy more productive, get better value for money for the taxpayer.
But Prime Minister, I've asked you if you're going to cut spending on public services. Are you going to cut spending on public services?
Well, what I'm going to do is make sure we get value for money for the taxpayer. But I'm very, very committed to making sure we've got excellent frontline public services. And I'm not going to go into what the Chancellor will announce in his medium-term fiscal plan.
At the end of November.
He's going to announce that very shortly. It will come together with an OBR forecast. That's very important.
But hang on.
But my approach is to help people get through this very difficult winter, and it's a problem we're facing internationally.
But, so this is quite a straightforward question. Are you going to cut public spending on public services? And I've asked you a couple.
And she'll have to. There's no other option but to cut spending on public services. There's just no option. Like, you have there's three choices: cut public services, reintroduce the top rate of tax, or the economy collapses. Simple as that.
Couple of times, and
also she's saying, well, we'll need to curb inflation because by dealing with the energy crisis, which will indeed absolutely, by capping the energy prices in the way that they have done, that will help inflation, no doubt. And again, as I said, I disagree with the way that she's done it, but it's at least good that the government has taken action on the energy crisis to bring people's bills in somewhere closer to normalcy, even though the normal bills that we had previously were more than some people could afford to pay. But I digress. But by also doing these ridiculous fiscal measures, she's made inflation worse, no matter what your particular understanding of the economy is, right? If you're a Keynesian, right, if you believe in Keynesian theories of inflation, then what she's done by getting rid of that top rate of tax is massively increase aggregate demand in the economy. So by increasing aggregate demand in the economy, there's now more there's more demand for goods and services, meaning that the increase in demand means that prices increase to meet that demand, which again causes more inflation. But if you're a monetarist and then you believe that the only thing that matters with regards to how much inflation there is the overall money supply, by the Bank of England having to print a bunch of money to be able to shore up the pension funds, that's injected a huge amount of money into the economy and inflated the overall money supply, and so has all the additional borrowing that she's committed to deal with the energy crisis. So it doesn't matter which way you look at this. She's making inflation worse deliberately by the fiscal policy that she's engaged in, which is going to wipe out any gains that we have due to the price caps on energy per unit. Right, Bilderberg.
I'm going to won't answer it directly, suggest that you're going to.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't, because I can't exactly set out what is going to be in this plan. What I can promise is we're going to reduce debt as a proportion of GDP.
By when?
But the point in the medium term, and we will set out exactly what that is when we put out the medium-term fiscal plan. But the point about reducing debt as a proportion of GDP is it all depends on how fast the economy is growing. And the key thing is to get the economy growing faster, so the pie is bigger and we can afford more money for great public services, as well as...
Okay, so this is just kind of bastardised Laffer curve economics she's talking about here, but she's not shown us how cutting this specific top rate of tax might ever increase money for the exchequer in the long term via looking at the Laffer curve or whatever. She's not detailed this to anybody. And as far as I'm aware, as I said, if you look at the history of the economic plan in the UK, when there has been higher taxes, looking at the 50p rate under Gordon Brown, the economic growth was higher than it was when we engaged in austerity and when we reduced the top rate of tax under George Osborne and David Cameron. So again, as far as real world studies of this, I have no actual, no one's presented me with any evidence that this is going to work.
Helping people keep more money.
But you've got an additional challenge, haven't you? You've got an additional challenge because inflation means that things are getting more expensive right across the board. They're getting more expensive for everybody watching this morning, everybody trying to run a business. Also, inflation means that things are getting more expensive in government departments. Now, will you increase government spending for different departments so that they can cope with inflation at that level? Because if you don't, they're dealing with a real terms cut, aren't they?
But this is why
I don't know why Laura Kuenssberg is even asking this. Because she's not held her to account anything. Right? We're not discussing bankers' bonuses. We've not had any discussion of mortgages, no discussion of pension funds, no discussion of the 65 billion printed by the Bank of England to shore up the pension funds, anything like that. And you're absolutely right, Bilderberg. And she's specifically saying, "Oh, this will grow the economy," but she's not published the Treasury forecast, and she's not and she's only just about to hold talks with the Office of Budget Responsibility. This has all been done out of nowhere. Like, what the fuck is going on? She doesn't want to outline what's in the policy because she knows that if she does say it, people will get angry with her even more so than she is. Or that in fact, she's keeping it secret from even the party because she knows that they're already pissed off with her.
Package is so important because the energy announcement we have made is estimated to reduce inflation by up to 5%.
In the short term, that might not happen.
And it's interesting that she's saying specifically the energy announcement is going to reduce inflation, because that's true. That's unequivocally true that the energy bill announcement that she's done on price caps, that will reduce inflation. But she's not saying anything about the rest of the policies outlined in her fiscal event and what they're going to do to inflation, which, spoiler alert, they're going to make it worse.
In the long term, some economists have questioned that. Just as it perhaps might in the short term, but you can't be sure of that long term.
Well, we are expecting inflation to peak as the sort of cost of increased energy prices flows through the system. We're expecting inflation to peak. I'm not going to write, future budgets on your show, much as you'd like me to do, Laura. But the core principle I believe in is maximising growth in the economy. That's why we're pulling all the levers on everything from making our tax system.
The fact that she just talks the audience, or to the public, like we're all children. Because the issue is that she's the child here. I don't think she even quite understands herself how these policies are going to be actually playing out, what the effective utilities of these policies are. All she is a nice little convenient puppet for think tanks like the IEA and the Heritage Foundation that she has historical links to treat the UK like a petri dish to be able to experiment with their ridiculous libertarian ideology. Exactly, housing costs will outweigh it instantly like that.
Simpler and lower.
Unless, of course, A, you're somebody who already owns the house, in which case you certainly vote Tory already, so she didn't have to care. And second of all, if you're somebody who can easily buy houses with cash, like huge private equity firms, which I wonder where Liz Truss might be getting her donations from. It's an interesting question.
Also, getting projects done quicker driving reform in our economy, as well as we make our public sector more efficient. But I'm absolutely committed to delivering great public services for people. That is very.
But yeah, she explicitly, you can see what she's saying. I can't commit to saying that we might spend more on public services, but I will commit to make sure the public services are good, which is her way of saying we're going to be cutting funding. I just don't want to tell you that we're cutting funding, because then people will get angry with me. It's exactly the same with what they talked about in 2010 about raising VAT.
Very, very important.
But that's not the same as saying that you'll make sure departments have enough money to combat inflation. That's not the same as saying you're not going to cut public spending.
Well, I believe in outcomes rather than inputs. I believe in what people see and what people feel. So, for example, the Health Secretary has committed that people will be able to see their GP within 2 weeks. And that's what we're focused on. We're focused on how does it feel for a patient? How does it feel for me as a woman walking down the street? Do I feel safe at night? These are the things I'm thinking about as Prime Minister. And that's what we're focused on, delivering better public services. And I think quite often, frankly, the debate focuses too much on the input.
Either that, it's not it's not just cover for her saying she's going to spend less money on public services. It's also cover for her saying that there's going to be even more private involvement in public services. Actually, with debt this high, and with the amount of borrowing that's been committed to already, plus the tax cuts, and plus the increase in the bond yields and that kind of spiralling out of control, I wonder whether she will, maybe not, whether she's going to privatise a bunch of stuff, but she might actually engage in PFIs to be able to get extra funding on the sly without having to increase the overall national debt. That might be something that she does.
And not enough on how it actually feels for people in Britain. And they want public services that are focused on delivering for them.
Services, absolutely. But let's talk then about one of those specifics and one of those real-life consequences for government decisions. Boris Johnson promised that he would raise benefit payments in line with inflation. Do you stand by that? Will you?
Well, this is something the Department of Work and Pension Secretary is looking at the moment. So she will make a determination on that, and we will announce that this autumn.
So, as Prime Minister, you won't guarantee this morning that you'll keep Boris Johnson's promise to raise benefits in line with inflation? Because
So it's not happening. Again, it's just not going to happen. Mark my words. Yeah, 100% Bilderberg, yeah, 100%. They've already committed to cutting benefits. We've not heard the overall policy, but Kwasi Kwarteng explicitly said that he was going to try and cut in work benefits to try and get people who are only in part-time work to then go into full-time work, to be able to increase the amount of people, or the amount of what's the term I'm looking for? Overall kind of labour participation in the economy. Yeah, almost certainly will be brutal. Yeah, 100%. It means the people who are working part-time because they have other commitments like childcare are just going to be, I don't know how they're going to possibly cope at this point.
Consequence of that would mean for many people who rely on benefits, most people who claim benefits are working, that they could see a cut in their income. Let's just be clear about what that would mean.
This is something the Department of Work and Pension Secretary will look at. It's worth saying, on our energy package, not only are we making sure that the average household doesn't pay bills of more than around £2,500, we're also, for the poorest households, providing an extra £1,200. So there is significant...
I mean, that's very true. I mean, to be fair, probably nowhere. If he's a Tory, we all know about how hard it is for Tories to find dates these days. So he's probably not been touched in donkey's years, considering.
Support going into the poorest households this winter.
But you won't make
and I will always make sure, Laura,
on inflation.
I will always make sure we protect the most vulnerable in our society.
What about pensions?
In all the decisions we make.
Okay, what about pensions, Prime Minister? Will pensions go up in line with inflation?
I mean, that is true. Someone who is very high might consent.
I've committed to the triple lock.
Okay, so the triple lock for our audience who aren't familiar with it.
Again, you just look at it. We're very, very happy to make sure we spend the welfare budget on old people, namely our voter base, even though we potentially crashed all of their fucking pensions. But we'll happily tear money away from the poor and the vulnerable. Again, that's why there was a wishy-washy "I promise to protect the vulnerable" statement when she was asked explicitly about keeping the benefit raised with inflation, and yet when she was not committing to anything, but as soon as the triple lock statement came up, she was 100% not changing the triple lock. That's the policy. I wonder why she was so coy about the first answer. Who could possibly tell?
Pensions always rise in lockstep with inflation. One thing
you're trying to get every single detail of the medium-term fiscal plan out of me on this show.
This is an opportunity. That's why you're here. One of the
big... it depends what's going to happen on the 14th, right? Once the help that the Bank of England gave for the previous issue with pensions, once that expires, what's going to happen then?
bold decisions that you have made as Prime Minister, which you have made a commitment on, is to scrap the top rate of tax. Now, there has been a lot of controversy around this policy. Some people in your party love it. Some people in your own party do not love it. The opposition parties have decried it. There's been a lot of controversy around that decision. Are you absolutely committed to abolishing the 45 pence tax rate for the wealthiest people in the country?
Yes. And it is part, Laura, it is part of an overall package of making our tax system simpler and lower. But I think it's worth noting, in the package we announced, the vast majority of that package is the energy package.
And we talked a lot about that, but
it's the energy package. It's
Yeah, 100% Bilderberg. It's pathetic.
national insurance. The 45p rate actually raises very little and makes our tax system, more complicated. And
It's not too complicated. Everyone understands what you mean, Liz.
we need to move away. We need to move away from the idea that everything is about how we redistribute resources.
We've literally not been talking about redistribution for 12 years of Tory government. We've had 12 years of Tory government when the entire conversation was about the strong economy, and taking money away from poor people, right? We had a brief respite under Boris Johnson. We had a brief respite where Boris Johnson, because of the pandemic, said, look, let's make sure that we keep an economy that works for everybody. At least that was his outward talking point, right? He may not have actually adhered to that through policy in wholesale, but at least that was he clearly wanted to be a populist leader rather than, a libertarian or neoliberal leader. And so was very happy to, at least in the abstract, think that he was, governing on the behalf of everybody. But for every year before that, under Theresa May, under David Cameron, there was no discussion about redistribution whatsoever. And the entire focus was on, we need to get the deficit down, and we don't matter how many people that we send to an early grave to do it.
We also need to make sure we have got a tax system that's competitive internationally, and it's helping us bring in the investment, get people into work,
and you've
get
made that very
people
clear that
wanting
getting the
to
economy
get up the
going is your
career ladder.
priority. You've made that very clear. Can I ask you, Prime Minister, did you discuss scrapping the top rate with your whole cabinet?
No. No, we
think-
didn't.
What does she expect the rest of the party to do when they're literally just making things up on the fly, getting the phone call from the IEA, like Emily Carver and Matthew Lesh going, yeah, just cut the 45% rate of business tax, of income tax. And they're like, oh yeah, okay, oh yeah, we'll do that. Just like, these people are idiots. These people just completely, no thoughts, head empty.
It was a decision that the Chancellor made.
Do you think that that is the right way to go about developing what has become a very controversial policy? You say it doesn't cost that much money, but it's a big decision, isn't it? If you'd been in Boris Johnson's cabinet and he had announced something like that without asking you, how would you have felt?
We have committed, and I committed during the leadership campaign, to make our system more competitive, to lower our taxes and to simplify our taxes. And I think that's fundamentally important. Now, when budgets are developed, they are developed in a very confidential way. They're very market sensitive. Of course, the cabinet is briefed, but it's never the
I'm assuming the bit that we've all seen on Twitter is coming up now, so I'll wait for that.
case on budgets that they are something that is created by the whole cabinet. The principles, though, are extremely clear.
But how do you think
and the principles are about?
Perhaps some of your cabinet might have raised what some of your
Yeah, JDM, I'm entering my racism arc.
other colleagues who are not in the cabinet have raised, is the optics of all of this. I mean, to viewers listening this morning, you won't commit to raise benefits in line with inflation, and if you don't, that will mean a cut in income for some of the least well off in the country. You will commit to cutting tax for the most wealthy. How do you think that looks?
I don't care how it looks. I don't again, all this focus on optics has happened the whole time. No, please just talk about the material reality that you are creating. Look, the cuts that could potentially come to benefits will leave people homeless or possibly even dead, and the man that's going to get cut from people who are the richest in the country can just get spent on fucking yachts. That's the material reality that you're entering into, and entirely ideologically. I don't really maybe we can have an optical choice about how that looks, but again, now we're getting to the discussion of whether something is quote-unquote fair or not. Spoiler alert, I do not give a shit about fairness. Fairness is a nonsense term. It means loads of different things to different people. Everyone has a different concept of fairness. Whereas why don't we actually talk about the effective utility of the policies and what they're actually going to do to make people's lives materially better? That's a discussion that I want to have, right? So, for example, if you can have a discussion about fairness with somebody who has this kind of axiomatic belief in property rights that I absolutely do not share, then you cannot have a discussion about these people about tax policy where you try and make the case that a progressive tax system is quote unquote fairer, because they will literally tell you that taxing them more will be theft, and that is not fair on them. So it's a nonsense philosophical position to take up, the things being quote unquote fair. Just say which is going to make a better society or not, and give the reasons why, and abandon the concept of fairness, because you'll never convince anybody of any arguments.
What I care about is about making our country successful.
Someone clip that.
Making our economy successful. And I do think that there has been too much focus in politics about the optics or how things look, as opposed to the impact they have on our economy. The fact is, Laura, we've had 2 decades of...
Well, it's amusing that Liz Truss is now making the materialist argument here, and I'm like, good, okay, now acknowledge the fact that you'll send people to early graves with if you do what you've said you're going to be doing within work benefits.
Relatively low growth, and decisions have been made historically quite often on the basis of we can't do this because X will be annoyed or Y will be annoyed, and that leads to a failure to make decisions over time. And we've ended up with a very complicated tax system. We've ended up with our tax system and our tax burden at a 70-year high, and that has not led to economic...
The tax system is not difficult. It's not a difficult system. This idea of, we have to simplify it by ensuring that the richest pay less. That's how we're going to simplify it. Like, was reducing the regular rate from 20% down to 19% about simplification? It was clearly about decreasing the tax burden on people, which, to be fair, I'm not massively against cutting the 20% rate down to 19%. Like, makes very actual little difference as far as I'm concerned. I don't get any extra money from this reduction in my tax burden, right? But at least I can understand the rationale behind it, even though I think it probably would be better just to make sure that you're not massively inflating aggregate demand by giving everybody extra money that they probably won't see a huge amount of difference from personally, but overall, when you look at the economy, it might have a bigger difference. But that makes no odds, right? But if you want to simplify the tax system, then why is income tax different to capital gains tax, to dividends tax? Why are these all taxed in different ways? Corporation tax. Why are people, the way they make their money, giving people different amounts of tax they have to pay on their income as it comes in, right? Why is this not more streamlined and stratified? Because at the moment, people who get paid for doing nothing, you just make money out of having capital, whether it be capital gains tax, whether it be getting paid out in shareholder dividends, etc., etc. Why are these people paying less tax than people who actually work and actually generate productive labour for the society that creates the wealth of our civilization? How is that fair? How is that simple? Yet the discussion we're having around the simple economy is happening around whether or not rich people pay more tax or not, which is nonsensical.
Economic growth. So we do need to make, Laura, tough decisions. And I'm very clear.
Perception does matter in politics, doesn't it? Doesn't perception matter?
It does matter.
How do you think some people might feel this morning when they read that Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor, was at a drinks party the day of the mini-budget with hedge fund managers, some of whom may have then gone on to gain from a fall in the value of the pound?
Well, the Chancellor...
No, please, Laura, just call it what it is. It's insider trading. It obviously is. Literally going to a cocktail party where he was laughing about how he was going to cut the benefits of people to all of his mates in the city who have all bet against the pound, people who he used to work for, who bet against the pound to be able to make a huge amount of money shorting the pound at that point, right? Like, this is, like, let's stop talking about, again, whether or not, this looks bad or not. This is just clear conflict of interest, which you shouldn't have if you want to govern correctly, because, again, it leads to a worse society if everyone's only looking for their own, looking out for number one, looking in their own self-interest. But again, Liz Truss is fine with this because she's an objectivist, and that's her own ridiculous moral philosophy that makes no bloody sense. And, why can they not just go a week without a scandal? It's crazy.
Meets business people all the time. That's his job.
Did you know he was going to go off and do that?
I do not manage Kwasi Kwarteng's diary, believe me.
Well, the difference between speaking with business leaders and laughing at with business leaders about how you've crashed the pound and how you're cutting people's benefits. Like, there's a difference between that. Like, I can't believe that, people can have the wool pulled over their eyes in this incompetent a manner.
But would you tell him not to do that again? I mean, do you think at a time when many people are struggling, as you've said this morning, you want to reassure people who are struggling and having a hard time in what might be a very hard winter, would you say to him, do you know what, just don't do that again? Because it might give people the impression that you care more about people in the city who have a lot of money, who are...
But there's not the impression. We know that that's exactly the case. They're Conservatives. They're in the Tory party. That's always the only thing they've ever cared about, right? But the explicit thing is that how this specific policy is being exposed as being, in part at the very least, to specifically benefit people making deals behind the scenes, right? Passing brown envelopes under the table.
Going to gain from the scrapping of the top rate tax than you do from people you've mentioned, who you want to reassure, who you want to help. Would it have been better if he hadn't gone?
I mean, I get up every morning as Prime Minister thinking, how can we make our country more successful? How can we reassure people? How can we help people get through these very difficult times? And we do face difficult times. You know, the war in Ukraine is regrettably continuing. Vladimir Putin is continuing with his saber-rattling rhetoric. You know, we do face very, very difficult circumstances, and that's what I'm focused on. That's what the Chancellor...
Okay, so all of what you're saying about the energy crisis and what you're saying about the war in Ukraine, that directly relates to specifically one thing, and that's the price of wholesale gas coming from Europe, right? That is the main issue. There's also some supply chain issues with food, what have you, but this is one completely separate issue to the rest of the fiscal statement that was made, and the rest of the fiscal new policy changes. Like, why is like, she just can't give a straight answer and just deflects every single time. She just pivots. Oh God, it's infuriating. Just answer the fucking question, Liz.
Focused on, and that is what the whole cabinet is focused on.
Now, you've admitted this morning that there were some mistakes. You should have prepared people more carefully for your big announcements. Was one of those mistakes not publishing the forecast from the Office of Budget Responsibility, which are the independent number crunchers who basically check the government sums? Was that a mistake?
The issue with the Office for Budget Responsibility, and I've worked with them before when I was Chief Secretary to the Treasury, is it does take a while to produce those forecasts because it's an iterative process.
Well, hang on, they had
one was produced and then you refused to release it.
They had something ready to go. We know that. They had something that you could have put in the public domain that would have given people an idea.
But the problem is that there is a process that you need to go through where the policies are fed in, the forecast is then made, and it develops over time. We simply didn't have time to go through that process.
So it wasn't
because of the very... Absolutely not. Because it was a very urgent situation. And I do go back to this point.
No, but you already announced the energy plan, right? You could announce you could have just done the energy plan, released the OBR's forecast and the Treasury's forecast about what would happen because of the energy plan, and none of this might theoretically have happened. The issue is actually with the fiscal statement that you'd made. So this deflection towards we had to cover the energy bills is nonsensical.
That we were facing a winter where people would have been paying bills of up to £6,000, where we would have seen inflation 5% higher than it otherwise would have been, and where we would have seen a more slowing economy, and I couldn't let that happen, Laura.
And you've made that point.
I completely want to work with the OBR. We had a very good meeting with them and the Chancellor this week. You know, they are going to be a full part of the medium-term fiscal plan.
Now?
But what I couldn't do, what I absolutely refused to do, is allow people to go into this winter worrying about their fuel bills. That was my priority.
But may I ask you a yes or no question?
That's true. It literally is. She's just like a Woody doll with a bunch of pre-prepared phrases that you pull the drawstring and it's just war in Ukraine, a strong economy, growing the size of the pie, lower tax burden.
Calls now for you to publish what you have already from the OBR, those forecasts. The opposition's calling for it, some people in your own party are calling for it. Yes or no, will you publish it before the end of November?
Well, no. For the following reason, Laura, that it's not yet ready because it's got to go through this process. I know, having been Chief Secretary, the process we go through.
So why didn't you wait for that? Well, why did you wait for that process why didn't you wait, for that process to go through, but then before announcing the package that you've done? Before you'd even announce it, it's your own fucking cabinet, Liz.
And there's no point in publishing something that's not ready.
And you've made that very clear.
The OBR and the Treasury are busy compiling a discussion of the fiscal policy that you may or may not be announcing at some point in the future, and then you announce it before they've finished their forecast and before you've even told your own party or even your own cabinet. She is just an absolute train wreck. Yeah, it's difficult. It really is difficult, to understand how on earth she actually is the most powerful person in the country. Like, Boris Johnson may have been an idiot, right? He may have been a absolute blithering fool, but he wasn't this stupid. He wasn't just this absolutely brain dead and dumb that she is, right?
Prime Minister, you've made that very clear.
If anything, Boris Johnson was just far more evil, really, with the shit that he did and all the comments that he'd made about minorities and all of the underhanded shit that he did, right? Like, Boris Johnson was clearly far more calculating, whereas Liz Truss is just no thoughts, head empty, just a direct live drip of saline coming out of the IEA and into the fiscal policy.
That very clear. I think what's on a lot of people's mind this morning
And she dresses herself by looking at old pictures of Margaret Thatcher and then copying it. Like, she's got Margaret Thatcher to be able to cling on to there at the very least.
is how they feel they've been affected by the decisions you made in terms of increases in mortgage rates. We know hundreds of mortgage products were taken off the market. You know, people are desperately worried about interest rates. And you mentioned your energy bill a lot, but we had an email from a viewer last night saying, we're very grateful for the help we've had with our energy bills, but the effect of the mini budget or mortgages has meant hundreds more each month for us in mortgage payments. Your energy help may help millions of people. It may be generous.
It will help
but
millions
this
of
cost
people.
is being wiped out by other costs and increases in mortgage.
That's fine, because the people who all own their own homes already, they don't have to worry because their mortgage rates aren't going up, and they're the people who make up the majority of the Conservative voter base.
What is the logic of giving people money to help with their energy bills if they then lose some of it because their mortgage goes through the roof because of the consequence of the decisions you've made?
Well, I understand that people
I love
are
it.
worried
Nice
and
one,
people are
Bilderberg.
struggling. It's a very difficult time. We have to look at the mortgage issue.
Could be ERG or IEA.
Which is the Bank of England set interest rates, not the government. You know, this has rightly been independent since 1997. And we are facing a world in which interest rates are rising. In fact, our interest rates set by the Bank of England are lower than those of the Federal Reserve
Just briefly,
and lower than those other
but
countries.
do you acknowledge that some people are going to...
And the issue isn't about whether or not the actual overall rate is higher than the Federal Reserve or not. The issue is the very large spike that's been triggered by this fiscal policy. Right? It's fine if it goes up over time if people can make preparations. It's really difficult to make preparations for your mortgage immediately increasing by £150, like overnight.
end up being worse off because their mortgage has gone up by more than their energy bill is being controlled by the government for you. Do you accept that?
We want to do all we can to help homeowners. You know, we've helped with stamp duty.
Because the issue is that Liz Truss isn't. The people keep saying, actually, people were mentioning it on Question Time the other night, and they say the Conservatives are the party of home ownership, right? No, they're the party of homeowners. They don't care about getting people onto the property ladder. They care about protecting the people who are already there and ensuring that their interests are maintained. Obviously, that's gone a little bit further now, where it's now not just people who are on the property ladder, it's people who have gotten off the property ladder by paying off their mortgage, like literally they're retired. I was looking at a graph the other day, it was a breakdown of voting in the 2017 election, and if you break it down by work type, so it doesn't matter whether you're part-time, full-time employment, a retired, carer, disabled, student, unemployed, the only demographic of work status that voted more for Theresa May was the retired. Everybody who was in work or not in work but not retired all voted Labour in plurality. So it's just, they're the party of the retired boomers, and that vote, unfortunately, slowly dying out.
That was one of the announcements in the mini-budget. But ultimately, interest rates are a matter for the Independent Bank of England, and the Independent
Yes, they are part of the Independent Bank of England, but the Bank of England responds to fiscal statements made by the government. So even you can say, oh, well, it's just the Bank of England's fault. No, it's your fault for having ridiculous monetary and fiscal policy.
Bank of England do have to look at what is happening
But we're asking about
around
mortgages,
the
not
world.
interest rates, and mortgages are not set by the Bank of England. Mortgage rates are a product of all sorts
But the
of factors,
interest rates
including
are a
decisions the
key
government made.
factor. The interest rates are a key factor in mortgage rates, and those are set by the Bank of England, and they're somewhat dependent on the global market. So, Laura,
The fact that Laura Kuenssberg at no point in this interview has explicitly said you cannot just blame this on the energy crisis, you cannot just blame this on the war in Ukraine. You have to explicitly say why there was why it was worth overall you engaging in the monetary policy and fiscal policy that you did, considering the overall knock-on effect that it's had on the rest of the economy.
not dealing with the issues
No worries, Alex. I'll catch you next one, mate.
we're dealing with in isolation. We're dealing with these issues in a world where there's a slowing global economy, where there are rising interest rates, where there is huge inflation, mainly driven by energy caused by Vladimir Putin's war. And I, as Prime Minister and the Chancellor, have to deal with that in the way that we think will help people in Britain most get through these very, very difficult short-term circumstances, but put our country on the best long-term footing. And that is what, that is what the package we have put together does.
We're running out of time, and you've made that point. How many people voted for your plan?
What do you mean by that? Sorry.
Well, you've set out a significant...
The pause. Now, this is the bit I've seen already. The pause is so telling. Like, that's the thing about all of this, right? That's the thing that kind of sums up all of this. And There is no electoral mandate for anything that she's doing. None of this was voted upon in a manifesto. This is all just stuff that she is taking from, again, the Ministry of Economic Affairs and people like Policy Exchange and the Centre for Policy Studies, all these neoliberal libertarian think tanks that have then just drip-fed her this policy platform that she then inflicted upon the country based off a tiny mandate of just the people who voted in the Conservative leadership election. Despite the fact that the MPs who were sitting in Parliament who were there to vote on it were elected upon an entirely different mandate that was Boris Johnson's at the 2019 election. If she was just continuing the mandate of that policy platform that was in that manifesto, there wouldn't be this big kind of hubbub about it. But the fact that she's so deviated so far from what was laid out in that manifesto, there's no possible mandate for any of this. But there's a crucial issue about all of this, is that the press are on the understanding that they just need to make sure the Conservatives stay in power, because that's their overall remit and has been for a huge amount of time. And there's just this underlying assumption that the Conservatives will just do this every single time, regardless of what's in the manifesto. So they refuse to scrutinise it. They refuse to scrutinise the fact that this is just not how a political system is supposed to work. Our political system is supposed to work in that you vote for MPs based off on a manifesto, and then they then vote on that those manifesto promises in government, and that is the mandate that they have. But the press are just like, this Conservative's going to be in power, Conservative's going to cut tax, Conservative's going to be neoliberal, and they ain't got a problem with it, then wait until the next election. Well, the economy's going to be screwed by then. It's just a nonsensical system that's driven by an absolutely toxic, ridiculous media landscape.
Significant change of direction from the Conservative government that you were being part of for many, many years. How many people voted for you to do that?
Well, people in 2019 who voted Conservative voted for a successful country where we are levelling up all parts of the country and where we're driving growth, enterprise and opportunity. Now, any government has to deal with the circumstances it faces. And we face this situation of, which was unforeseen, huge energy costs, rising inflation due to the war in Ukraine and the aftermath of COVID.
But you know
we
very
are
well,
delivering.
Prime Minister, that a small number of people in the Conservative Party, tens of thousands rather than the whole country, voted for you in the leadership contest, perfectly legitimately. But do you fear that you have put the country on a path that it didn't ask for, because you believe very strongly that it will lead to growth?
Seriously, no questioning about the fact that there is absolutely no mandate for this.
Finally, what happens if it doesn't work?
And she's not pressed her on that. She's not pressed her on the fact that there's no mandate. This is ridiculous. This is just so softball. Again, it's obviously because Kuenssberg is a Tory puppet. We know she's a Tory puppet. She always has been a Tory puppet, whatever. She never holds these people to any kind of scrutiny. There's a basic premise for the question that you're asking, and you're just not probing on any of this shit.
Well, what people voted for in 2019, when they voted for Conservative, sometimes for the first time.
Again, she was saying because they voted Conservative. There's this understanding that there just needs to be, as long as you vote for someone in a blue rosette, it means that you explicitly endorse anything that party might do in the future, and that's just not the case.
Years is they voted for a different future. They voted for investment into their towns.
A different future? You've been in power for 12 fucking years.
And cities, they voted for higher wages. They voted for economic growth, and that is what our plan will.
They voted for higher wages, did they? And why have wages been stagnant forever since the Conservatives got into power?
Deliver. I'm confident it will deliver. I'm absolutely confident that what we're doing on speeding up road projects, unleashing investment from the city, reducing taxes will deliver that. I'm not saying it's not going to be difficult. We do face a very turbulent and stormy time, but it will deliver. It will deliver on the promises we made. And in the
it just absolutely won't. There is zero evidence that any of this will work. Again, another thing that Laura Kuenssberg refuses to pin her down on, the actual effectiveness of the policy platform that she's laid out, given that there is we have studies showing that this trickle-down approach to economics does not work. We have there's actual peer-reviewed analysis of this showing that all that does is just gift more money to the rich at the expense of everybody else.
Circumstances, I'm very clear that we had to act quickly to get this plan going.
Okay, Prime Minister Liz Truss,
thank you very
so
much
much for joining us here in Birmingham this morning. Now, just to say, thanks for sticking us.
Utterly, it's just pathetic. It's just infuriating watching random people on local radio being better at holding the Prime Minister account than the previous political editor for the BBC.
During some technical glitches during that interview. Apologies for that. Now let's get on and hear what our panel had to say. Michael Gove, What did you make of Liz Truss? Some really interesting nuggets in there.
There certainly were, and I thought it was right for the Prime Minister to acknowledge that the events of Friday, that fiscal event, need to be revisited. There needs to be a recognition of mistakes, but I think that it's still the case that on the basis of what the Prime Minister said, and she was very clear and authoritative, but it is still the case, I think, that there is an inadequate realisation at the top of government of the scale of change required. So yes, the energy package was the most important thing in the fiscal event, but broadly 35% of the additional money that we're borrowing is not to cut energy costs, it is for unfunded tax cuts.
And you sound concerned about that. I mean,
Profoundly.
You're profoundly concerned.
Yes, because there are two things that are problematic, two major things that were problematic with the fiscal event. The first is the sheer...
I love how we go from the Prime Minister to someone else in her own party, and they immediately said, this is garbage, stop doing it.
...risk of using borrowed money to fund tax cuts. That is not conservative. And then the second thing is the decision to cut the 45 pence rate, and indeed at the same time to change the law which governs how bankers are paid in the City of London. Ultimately, at a time when people are suffering, and you're quite right to point out the concerns that people have, not just over mortgages, but over benefits, when you have additional billions of pounds in play, to have as your principal decision the headline tax...
I mean, Michael Gove is the only person who's made sense at so far on the whole of this, right? Literally, he's the only person speaking even a modicum of sense. I literally cannot believe we're in this situation. It's almost like that we're in this situation because people's engagement with the political and economic process has been entirely stymied by the fact that people were shrouding mist around the expertise of people who have huge amounts of knowledge of these subjects. It's almost like people are somehow tired of experts. I wonder where we've heard that phrase before.
Cutting tax for the wealthiest. That is a display of the wrong values.
It sounds right now, if things carry on as they are, you won't be able to vote for these measures as a Conservative MP.
The good thing, there are many good things in what Liz said, and I do welcome the broader points that she made about
But
growth.
can you vote for it as it stands?
But the critical thing is, Liz has acknowledged that, with hindsight, with welcome hindsight, that mistakes were made in the preparation.
Which is not. But to be fair, though, hang on a minute, Michael. She never, at no point in that interview, did she ever acknowledge that mistakes were made. With the actual policies that were laid out, she said that she should have communicated better, but she still stands behind literally everything that was in the fiscal event that was announced. She's not retracted any of the policy announcements or even said that any of the policy announcements were wrong. She said that the policy announcement that she did, she believes in, and that they said that they will work, even when she was asked explicitly what happens if it doesn't work. So, she's not actually committed to reversing any of this at all, Michael. But yeah, you're right. He's almost certainly planning for a leadership bid at this point. I do hope they vote down the budget. You may be thinking, no, Justice, you just want them to vote down the budget because you want the Tory government to collapse. No, I do want the Tory government to collapse. But no, they just have to vote down this budget because it will destroy the economy if it goes through. It has to get voted down for the good of the country. I do not care anymore about the overall electoral outcomes of any of this. I just care about making sure that people don't become fucking homeless at this point.
And as you're carefully avoiding my question about whether or not you'll vote for this in the House of Commons.
Well, I don't believe it's right.
Okay, that sounds like a no, but you don't quite want to go there. Sharon White, do you feel reassured at the beginning of the programme?
Also, the other reason as well why we want to make sure they vote down the budget, as well as it being the best thing for the country overall, but it's also will absolutely be the best part so far of the banter timeline. Because it goes down the road of what happens to Liz Truss. Does she just end up being the shortest serving Prime Minister? Again, further banter timeline, which I am super behind.
You sounded pretty concerned about what's going on. Has that reassured you?
I think the big issue is that even with the energy package, which is very welcome, I think we had a really good debate on this, is that you've got people and businesses and households who are still going to be facing a real cost of living squeeze. So I think about even my own business, and we're a very unusual business as a partnership because we're owned by our employees, our partners. We're stepping in as a business to provide cost of living support. So we're giving every partner £500 each,
to help them make ends meet.
free food over winter, and that's before
Is this someone from John Lewis? In which case, based?
Mortgage rates start to rise.
And from what the Prime Minister said, though, did you have more faith that they're putting their...
I mean, to give the Tory MPs their due, I can't believe, again, I'm doing this, but the more MPs supported Rishi Sunak than they did Liz Truss. Who we actually have to blame is the Conservative membership, who, as we've seen from all the Joe Politics interviews we've seen with these people, they're all stupid, right? They're all just like actual dunderheads. There's plenty of members of the PCP who are, they may be nasty, There may be bastards, right, who do not care about poor people and you just are, vindictive pieces of shit, but they do at least believe in making sure that the country's economy doesn't collapse, right? They mostly supported Rishi Sunak, considering until, of course, they supported Rishi Sunak until, of course, they all changed to supporting Liz Truss as soon as they knew she was going to win, so that they could try and squeeze into a cabinet position because they're all filthy fucking self-interested bastards or whatever. But they all knew that her economic policies had no merit to them whatsoever. And Rishi Sunak said as much during the leadership debates. In fact, Rishi Sunak was being mocked by The Spectator for saying that there would be a run on the pound and saying the gilt yields would increase and saying that there was going to be an increase in interest rates. He predicted all of these things and now they're all happening. There's, again, we can talk about the efficacy of the kind of economic model that these people want to have in place, which I absolutely despise. I know my Twitter bio is literally says neoliberalism hater, and I fucking despise that shit, right? But even if we're just talking completely objectively from a will this or will this not destroy the economy perspective, it is very obvious that the Tory membership are just stupid and do not understand the fuck what they're talking about, and that Rishi, despite his incredibly poor overall, moral compass and economic ideology, right? At least he had the base value of making sure of not wanting the economy to collapse.
Economy on the wrong path in the face of what clearly are very, very serious problems.
Well, if the budget gets voted down, we're in general election territory. Like, voting down a budget is essentially, this like a vote of no confidence at that point. If the budget doesn't pass, it's very, very rare for a prime minister to stick around afterwards. A conference budget, yeah, true, actually, yeah. They don't really care about how worried bill payers might think about it, or people buying government debt. Just talking up top 1% tax giveaways and bonus free-for-alls for donors and things like that. I mean, if it doesn't get put to Parliament, then we're absolutely screwed from there.
So I think it comes back to what happens next. So I think for the security and the stability that people and businesses need, I think the fiscal plan and ensuring that the numbers add up, so seeing how public spending balances with tax will be really important. So for us, what we'll gain on corporation tax reductions, we will lose even more in terms of higher interest rates. That'll be true. If you're on £25,000, you'll gain by
a huge business or a tiny business.
A huge business or tiny business, but for most ordinary people in the country on wages of 20,000 plus, they're going to lose thousands potentially on mortgage rates, while gaining much less
Yeah, almost certainly COJ if that's the case.
On tax changes.
Peter, you'll have been having similar conversations to me in the last couple of days with Conservative MPs who've been really nervous, some of them very unhappy, some of them still content with the plan. But do you think what we heard this morning is going to calm any of the jitters or maybe make it worse?
I doubt it, because my big takeaway from that is that the Prime Minister is sticking to her guns. She's acknowledged that the problems with communication, but as far as she's concerned, the issues were with laying the groundwork to the announcement. It wasn't with the substance of the announcement itself. And the conversations I've had with MPs over the last few days are very much about the substance of it. One little extra bit that I thought was very striking was when you asked her about the 45p rate. She was very clear that it was the Chancellor.
Yeah, that's why it was explicitly called a fiscal event, so they could avoid any scrutiny and avoid having to put it to the cabinet or even the members before announcing it, right? If it was an official budget, we'd have to go through all of the fucking nuts and bolts around that there before it ever became public. But the fact it's just been called a fiscal event means that they can keep it secret until it gets revealed.
Decision. That's the first time I've heard her kind of point the finger of blame at him, and that makes you wonder, actually, is everything actually, how's that relationship going to be going forward? Because of course one of the things that Tory MPs are saying is, as well as making some sort of like changes to the package itself, they are also asking whether it's feasible for Kwasi Kwarteng to continue in his role as Chancellor.
Let's talk about something else.
But there's absolutely no way that Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss are separating at this point. They're both baked into their positions as far as I'm concerned, given that the only mandate they basically have at this point is because they are the little kind of playthings, the little marionettes of the think tanks who put them into the position they're in at the moment, just implementing their policy verbatim without question. They are and out. I think it's very clear to me that these two are going to be sticking around in their positions for as long as the other one is.
Ukraine, of course, there's a lot of coverage in this morning's newspapers about what is going on and President Putin's extraordinary claim and these fake referendums in the last few days. But there's also discussion of Ukraine's request to join NATO. And Michael Gove, do you think the UK should support that bid?
No.
Why?
I think that it would be too grave a risk for the United Kingdom and the alliance. I believe that the support that we're giving to President Zelensky is right. I think we should do everything that we can in order to support him in that conflict. But it is a significant step.
I mean, she's happy to put the knife in to the rest of the Conservative Party who aren't part of the little bloc that she's in. But if she wants to continue having someone, I mean, I guess if Kwasi Kwarteng suddenly diverges away from the little kind of Heritage Foundation, CPS policy exchange bubble that is driving her fiscal policy, right? If he diverts away from that, then he'll maybe lose his job. But I'm fully aware that, I'm fully of the opinion, that I believe that he is in that same pocket that she's in. So I think the likelihood of her jettisoning him to save face without them both going is very, very low. I mean, maybe that is the case. Maybe that they both agree behind the scenes that he needs to be able to become the fall guy for the fallout from all of this. I mean, to be fair, the Tories have been really good over the past year or so at finding a fall guy to be able to take the flak for any amount of the issues that they've caused, right? Remember when they offered up Matt Hancock as like fresh meat to the press when there was the issues during COVID, right? People like Gavin Williamson, who spent ages getting absolutely hounded, with good reason because he's terrible, but it always took the blame away from Boris Johnson, firing Allegra Stratton, all that kind of stuff. It never, ever got right to the top until the Chris Pincher scandal, which directly called into question Boris Johnson because he was the one who promoted him, and then there was no chance at that point. He was directly implicated by the Chris Pincher scandal. But up until then, there was always some scapegoat that they could be able to lay the blame on to be able to quote unquote save Big Dog. So maybe Kwasi Kwarteng is the one that gets the chop, but I think that'd be a mutual agreement between the two of them to save their ideology, rather than Liz Truss specifically on her own making sure that she saves her own skin selfishly at his expense, right?
To extend a guarantee to Ukraine, which would mean that in any future conflict, if Ukraine's borders or territorial integrity were in any way infringed, we would be...
Remember at the time when people started quitting the cabinet, right? And there was nobody left for cabinet positions, so Boris Johnson was forced to resign. Because there'd been so many fall guys at that point, he probably didn't have anybody left in his inner circle. They'd all been jettisoned to save his career at that point. And now we're at the point at which there's huge amounts of the Conservative Party in cabinet probably going to have to not stand at the next election because they've all got so much grubby shit attached to them from the absolute clusterfuck that was the Boris Johnson premiership that they'll probably just think, oh, well, screw it, I'm out of politics now, I might as well go work in an investment bank or a private equity firm.
Committed to sending British armed forces into that conflict. I think that is a step too far.
Okay, interesting to hear that. Well, we've all seen very often, haven't we, pictures of world leaders, particularly Boris Johnson, travelling to Kiev to meet President Zelensky. But one of the fascinating things about this is he's also getting huge support online and from Hollywood stars to show their support for the country.
Well, that's probably the end of the actual stuff with regards to the fiscal events, so I won't play you any more of that. But yeah, just in general, incredibly frustrating that Laura Kuenssberg refuses to hold her to account. There's been doesn't feel like there's any intention to reverse any of these things. What it really comes down to is whether or not the budget gets past the Commons, which is going to be the big kind of sticking point, and how this goes down with the rest of the membership at the conference this weekend, which I guess we'll have to cover if there's any footage of it. But even so, just no answers, all just deflection, all just trust the process. I believe in my ideological dogma. If it fails, then something else must have gone wrong because I must be right. And she doesn't know what the fuck she's doing. So yeah, hardly fills me with confidence. But if you are a future YouTube viewer and you want to subscribe, please give us a like and subscribe and a comment to help the video in the algorithm. And you can also check the links in the description and over there if you want to follow me on the rest of my socials. Because I stream live on Twitch. You can also become a member on YouTube now for 99p, or you can subscribe on Twitch for $3.99 or for free with a Twitch Prime. And if you want to contribute, that would always be appreciated.